Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a rainy afternoon. We're really, all of us, thrilled to see that there's so much interest in this new initiative that we're going to be talking about today. I am Kim Elliott. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for Global Development. For those of you who may not have been here before, we're a 501c3 nonprofit educational think and do tank. We do lots of deep, we like to think, thinking. Everything we do is based in rigorous research, but we also do try to reach out and to communicate and to do what we can to see that the policies to improve the lives of the poor are actually adopted. And so that's what we're about. We're here today to talk about food security. And I'm sure all of you are well aware of the challenges over the next 30 or 40 years with another 3 billion people being added to the planet, almost a billion that are already hungry or malnourished, increasing demands for food as a result of rising incomes and demand for meat and dairy and other resource-intensive products, increasing demands for biofuels, all of that in the face of climate change and the challenges that that poses. So, to deal with all of these problems, obviously we need a range of policies. We need better trade policies. We need to reduce distortions, discipline biofuels, try and create sound safety nets for the poor to deal with price volatility of food. But yield growth is also slowing in many countries for many crops. And again, with climate change, clearly technology and innovation are to raise those yields, to improve productivity, and to improve food quality are key parts of the challenge. And so that's where we're going to focus today. And specifically, we're going to be discussing the implementation and future plans for a new initiative called AgResults. I was meeting with the panel beforehand, and they said they're very interested in hearing your ideas about where this initiative should go in the next round, and so we're going to try and leave plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. So what is AgResults? I'm just going to very briefly, because the panelists will explain more, but this is sort of a results-based financing mechanism intended to spur innovation and technology adoption for agriculture and food security. And what I want to do, just before handing it over to the panel, is to put this in the context of the broader donor efforts around improving aid effectiveness and using incentives and results-based outcomes to try and do that. This is an area that the center has spent a lot of time and effort trying to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of aid delivery. And I would recommend, there's a very nice working paper, or I think it's an essay by Bill Savadoff from a couple of years ago, where he sort of surveys this range of what he calls incentive-based approaches to aid to try and analyze, well, what are their key features, what distinguishes one from the other, and sort of how can we think about when to use these different kinds of mechanisms, ranging from conditional cash transfers for individuals, pay for performance contracts for various types of private or public contractors, up to cash on delivery aid for government to government aid, or even the MCC model where the Millennium Challenge Corporation sets out a range of indicators, and then governments that cross the threshold for those indicators sign contracts that they design. So the pull mechanisms, or what we're talking about, is a subset of these incentive-based approaches. This is what the AgResults initiative is trying to use. And like the other tools, they pay out only on the delivery of results, but then they have two additional features that distinguish them from these other kinds of incentive mechanisms. One is that they're focused on missing technologies, missing in the market. So this is both for innovation and for trying to encourage adoption of existing technologies. And a second one is that these mechanisms, with these mechanisms, the donors are trying to engage the private sector, ideally to create sustainable markets by creating demand for innovation and for technology. And the idea is to harness both the resources and also the creativity of the private market in developing solutions for problems in the agricultural arena. Just to sort of to source it, the AgResults expands on and grows out of a CGD proposal for advanced market commitments for vaccines to try and deal with the market failures that prevent vaccines from being developed for and marketed in developing countries. That initiative led many of these same donors to develop an advanced market commitment for pneumococcal vaccines that has led to these vaccines being introduced in a number of poor countries, very poor countries, much earlier than otherwise would have happened. So we do have one test of the mechanism. In that context, the advanced market commitment is one type of a pull mechanisms. Other types are various sorts of prizes and patent buyouts. Those are the kinds of things we're talking about. And you can find more information. I've just done a CGD brief that's out on the table. There are a couple of working papers. I think one of them's out there. Both of them are on the website if you want more information on that. So today we're going to hear from some of the people that have been involved in developing this initiative. We're going to start with, I don't think we're in order, oh, maybe we are in order at the table. We went away from the alphabetical. So we're going to start with Zoe Marks, who is a senior economist at the Department of Finance in Canada. And Canada has been a leader in this initiative and also on the Vaccines AMC initiative. And she is the co-chair of the steering committee for AgResults. Then we'll turn to Graham Dixie, who is an advisor in the Agriculture and Environmental Services Department at the World Bank. And he's been very involved in the technical side of developing the pilots for this first round of pilots. And he will tell you about the 3 that are being launched later this spring. And then we'll turn to Carrie Elgar, who manages G20 food security policy and programs for the Australian Agency for International Development. And you may know that Australia will be taking over the chair of the G20 at the end of the year from Russia for next year. And so she's very interested in your ideas for what the G20 could do to further expand and promote and use this new mechanism well. So let me turn it to Zoe.
Thanks, Kim. And thanks to the CGD for hosting us here today. I'm really thrilled to see that there's so much interest in AgResults, so thank you all for coming out in the rain. I'm looking forward to a good discussion and exchange of views today. I should note before we get going that the views I express today are not necessarily representative of the Department of Finance Canada or the Steering Committee for AgResults as a whole. So just to get going, I'll say that food security today is top of mind for Canada. We've made several substantial contributions in the last few years, but recognize that there's still more to be done, and we need every tool in the toolbox to tackle the outstanding challenges in this area. In the last few years, we've become particularly interested in exploring how targeted financing mechanisms can overcome market failures, leveraging innovative resources and delivering concrete results on the ground. The advanced market commitment for pneumococcal vaccines that Kim mentioned is one example of this, and the private sector window of the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program would be another result of this that have come from this ongoing exploration. Now, you may know that the idea for AgResults has been around for quite some time. Some of you may have worked in the initiative with the initiative or been exposed to it in the past few years, so you may have heard of the Agriculture Advanced Market Commitment, Agriculture Pull Mechanism. We've gone through a few different labels, a few different names, and we've finally settled on AgResults, so hopefully you're all okay with that. We've gotten where we are today with the help of a lot of partners. There's been a strong G20 presence on this initiative. The idea first got its first push at the 2010 G20 Summit in Toronto, where leaders made a commitment to explore this idea. Last year at the G20 Summit in Los Cabos, the Prime Ministers of Canada, Australia, and the UK, along with the President of the World Bank, came together to launch this initiative and pledge $100 million in support. So that's where we are today in terms of trying to put boots on the ground. And for those of you that have been exposed to this over the last few years, you'll know that a lot of people contributed to getting us where we are today. The CGD did some initial exploratory work on the idea of pull mechanisms in agriculture. After that, we brought in experts from around the world. There were 4 different thematic groups that were formed. They focused on increasing crop yields, no problem, reducing post-harvest losses, livestock, as well as nutrition. Those thematic groups brought together a lot of expertise, a lot of ideas. Those ideas were then vetted through an expert advisory group of also from experts around the world who were able to give their 2 cents and help shape the proposals. Along the way, the World Bank did a lot of work just in terms of developing the proposals further, and there was also a lot of contributions from different governments, from different international organizations, and different consulting firms as well. So I hope I'm not missing anybody there. I guess today we're pretty happy with where we are. We're moving forward at a pretty rapid pace. We have 3 pilots that are going to be launched in the next few months, and many more ideas that we want to develop, and also the opportunity to generate more ideas and come up with new pilots. I'll let Graham speak a little more to that, but I'll just say that we're just getting started here. We have $100 million pledged so far. We're really looking forward to seeing what we can do with that and seeing how we can move this initiative forward in the future. So I'll turn it over to Graham.
There were 3 things that I wanted to turn this on. There were 3 things I just wanted to lightly touch on. And one was to just give you a thumbnail sketch, how did we get to those 3 pilots? And secondly, a little bit about the learnings that are coming from it and how it might play out. We started with 4 thematic groups, with a group of somewhere between 6 and 10 people in each of those, in order to ground source ideas. And they generated in total around about 40. Those were tested against the expert group, and it was cut down to 10, which were expanded on, and then they zeroed it down to 5, and then the steering committee finally chose of those the 3 that would go ahead. And those were they were just more or less by chance are around maize in Africa. One is around aflatoxin control, which Kitty can address in more detail. One is around biofortification of maize, in other words, increasing the vitamin E content in maize in Zambia. And finally, one on improving on-farm storage in Kenya. The 2 that we didn't pursue at that time, one was that we looked at fertilizer, and the ideas that we came up with were considered to be not sufficiently ambitious by the steering committee, so we've put those aside and to revamp that. And the final one was on PPR, which is a vaccination in livestock, which there was a lot going on, so we postponed that until the ground became clearer. In terms of what we learned, I mean, does that process work? The thing you find with an expert panel or a thematic group is people always come up with their own pet project. And so one of the lessons is that you really need to, in the initial phase, is to think much bigger about what are the key issues, and then have brainstorming and ground sourcing sessions, probably with a wider group of people to be able to come down with what are those ones that you want to pursue. Then there was quite a lot of things when you actually engage with this process, is to think about how you would do it differently. And certainly the lessons from AMC were useful, but actually when you sit there and really think about agriculture and how many wonderful ideas are generated in the research station, but they never seem to find it in the field, so adoption became a bigger issue. But there's a world apart from an AMC process, which you just have to persuade 5 doctors in a country that this vaccination works, and trying to persuade 100,000 farmers that this is a satisfactory technology. So are the pilots right? Should we have been more ambitious? Well, I'd say 2 things to begin with. The first thing is practitioners on the ground really want this as a tool. Those of us who run large projects desperately want something in which we can capture and harness the skills and the dynamism of the private sector. And this idea of paying for results is something that gets us excited. Our VP of Africa said to us, I would have loved to have this as a tool when I was country director of Kenya. So we want to be able to get it right. We don't want it to burn down too quickly. We need to make sure that it works. And the second issue is that actually when you come to designing a project and you're dealing with $100 million of taxpayers' money, you've become much more thoughtful about how you're going to spend that money. And this is, let's make no bones about it. This is a risky area. I mean, whenever you start anything new, you make mistakes. And there's many, many things that you learn. So we need to start relatively small and be able to learn from the experiences on the ground. And the second thing is to just bear in mind, new products fail. I mean, if you look at the numbers of, say, new food products, every year about 120,000 are produced, of which about 50% of those which are extending a particular line, in other words, a technology or, going from orange juice to tangerine juice or something, they might get a 50% success rate. When you come in with new products, maybe a 30%. If you then look at this bell graph about which ones really work, probably only 1 in 30 of those 120,000 products have a turnover after 2 years of $1 million. And if you look at those who have a 50 million turnover, it's about 1 in 1,000. So that if we're going to get a spillover effect that the thing is going to really catch fire, this is a highly risky area. So initially, when you're thinking about projects and pilots, you look for things which you've got the basic tenets in ground. I mean, in particular, what we looked at for those first 3, and I'll explain them a little bit more detail, are ones where we've got a lot of private sector interest, and that we can come up with something which just provides a springboard for the private sector to learn the business model, but we're persuading them to go places they wouldn't normally go, or work in ways they wouldn't normally do, and it enables them to get started, and then the test is whether in 5 years' time some of them are still delivering that technology. In the main, we're working with 5 or 6 private sector companies. A lot of them, we don't specify the technology. So what we're putting out there is 5 or 6 companies, one of which may work, which would be fine. So we're spreading our risk by having a lot of different people involved. Turning into the products themselves, I think all of them have the potential of being important. On-farm storage, the studies we've done on missing food in Africa has indicated sort of 13% of food is being wasted. And what farmers mostly wanted in Africa was to store their product in their own house. And if this catches fire, I mean, one of the things that will emerge from this is that we will have on-farm buffer storage. That one of the huge problems in Kenya is the larger grain borer. And we have challenged the private sector to come up with solutions for the larger grain borer. Of those 7 companies that expressed an interest, 4 of them are already trying to come up with new technologies. We were surprised, actually, to see the kind of enthusiasm you get from the private sector. Turning to aflatoxin, I think we're only just got a small idea. I mean, when Kitty sat down and explained to us some of the problems of aflatoxin, the fact that it's a huge cause of liver cancer, the fact that it suppresses the immune system, it causes stunting, it has huge problems with livestock. But what governments are difficult to do is in a lot of countries, somewhere between 30 and 50% of the grain that is being marketed has aflatoxin contents above anything that would be acceptable in this country and Europe. And governments can't regulate until they have a tool which works. So if we can prove that that tool works, it has a potential for a much larger range of impacts. And then finally, it's the one where we're trying to encourage the uptake of biofortified maize. This is a vivid orange maize. This is a problem to get people to eat a vivid orange maize when they're used to eating white maize, but it has this high level of vitamin A content. Not only would it be wonderful if we could crack that, something we have never done in the aid sector, and maybe we should do more of, is how do you create a market? How do you stimulate demand, particularly for the kind of products which the smaller scale farmer can do? And then finally on fertilizer. This gives you a kind of sense of what you're doing, is that really the challenge is to come up with something which sets the target without specifying the technology. And what we are testing, and we've put up a bit of a straw man, is the idea of, can we look at the largest user of nitrogen fertilizer in the world, which is likely to paddy rice production. And when you realize that only about 30% of the fertilizer applied ended up in that rice plant, the rest is polluting our watercourse or causing climate change, can we come up with a number which is basically to relate for every ton of paddy rice we produce, how many tons of greenhouse gas equivalent are we producing at the moment, and to be able to set the private sector the target, no matter what technology they come up with, to halve that, and to offer them a proportionate prize once they have done the equivalent of Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic. Finally, just to give you a sense, this is a bit like venture capitalism. What we will get from this is it's very different when you sit there and engage intellectually with thinking about designing this project from a normal push project. It's very different, and you come up with different ways, and I'm sure we've only thought of about 10% of the different solutions. But one of the things that is true is that the difference between success and failure will be much more contrasty than a typical push project. In other words, we will get complete failures and we'll get huge successes. In our work, our average rate of return on agricultural projects is between 20 and 25%, and it's actually increasing and you get better. One of the things that we're trying to discover from this is, on average, if we look at a number of these projects, will we be able to generate a better return on taxpayers and development cost investment than we do out of these normally projects? And hopefully we could end up with something around 30%. I'll leave it at that.
I think both Zoe and Graham have done a great job of outlining both where we've come from in terms of concept and also some of the big global problems, whether they're concentrated in Africa or elsewhere, but that still have spillover effects or that still affect other parts of the world. So the pilots themselves are not an end in themselves, but are looking to really solve some of the big challenges that we're up against. What I'd like to concentrate on, just very briefly now, because I'd mainly like to hear from you, is where are we at now, where are we going, and what do we think success looks like for AgResults? In terms of implementation, as Zoe outlined before, we're about to gear up. It's been a long process. We've wanted to get implementation right. We've wanted to get as much commercial expertise on board as possible. We want to do business not as usual, but in an innovative way. And so that's meant taking our time and looking at not the usual suspects, if you like, for roles in secretariat and evaluation. So we're about to appoint a secretariat and an evaluator. I believe the contract's already been issued. So for the evaluator, not for the secretariat. So we're about to gear up. We're about to be able to really start putting this into action. One of the things that we'd like to be able to do is have results for the first pilots due in 2014. So that happens to coincide with Australia's G20 presidency. We'd also like to have started work on some new, ambitious, what I like to call global game changer initiatives. So pilots that really tackle some of the trickiest innovation problems that we have in agriculture. So fertilisers obviously well up there. The other issue that we wanted to clear up before we got going is it ODA? Graham described this work as a bit like venture capital, so it doesn't sound very much like aid, but I think in this beyond aid world, and particularly in the kinds of initiatives the G20 is dealing in, it's very important to look at how you do start to close that huge gap. I think it's 83 billion a year on agriculture in terms of the investment required that can't be met through the public sector. So how do we look at some of that beyond aid space, and how do we use aid to catalyse those flows? So the OECD tells us that yes, this is ODA, so that's been good news for this and other initiatives that want to take this direction. The new generation of pilots, as I said, we're looking at different pilots. We're looking at pilots that work more on those big innovation questions. And we're also looking beyond Africa. So it's likely that, a fertiliser, if we're dealing in rice, maybe in Asia, it's likely as well that there will be other pilots in other regions as we go along. We're not sure how many pilots we're going to be looking at. At the moment we've got 3 with a possible 2 on the waiting list. We originally said 10, but as we go along, we think that some pilots may require more finance than others. So the first 3 pilots are maybe relatively small scale in terms of their budget compared to, say, a larger innovation prize, for example. So it may be 6, it may be 8. We haven't determined an exact number of pilots. All we know that is we want an appropriate balance between adaptation pilots and innovation pilots in the end, so that we get to test the whole range of pull mechanisms available to us. Which brings me to my final point, what will success look like for this initiative? And I think that we can safely say that a lot of the success is going to be about the learning. It's no coincidence that we're allocating as much money to the evaluation side of this initiative as we are to the administration secretariat side, which is unusual. But what we're interested in doing is in learning about what works, what doesn't. This initiative is particularly interesting because in some ways it's high risk, in other ways it's very low risk. It's low risk because you only pay on results. So those normal questions that you ask about aid effectiveness, there's a very good answer to give your politicians on, is it effective? Yes, we only pay if the result is achieved. On the other hand, we're looking at some very difficult questions where the research done may not lead us to the answers that we want. But what we're interested in being able to do is to look at that part of the value chain that isn't working in the market, to say where can we intervene, to say how can we subsidise or how can we provide incentives to fix that bit of the value chain, and then how can we get out and let the market do its own work. So I think this is fascinating work. I think it's something that we're all looking to in donor agencies at least, to see whether or not we can look at a new model. We're all dying to get closer to the private sector and see how we can fill some of these big financing gaps. So some of the questions that I have for you is how could we scale up an initiative like this? We're working on pilots. In what ways do you think that we might be able to scale it up? In some cases where an innovation prize, for example, you do just walk away. In others where it's more linked to public education around maize, for example, or eating certain kinds of maize, there's going to need to be a sort of a longer term intervention and maybe adjustments for different countries depending on different circumstances. And the other question is, how do we get more upfront commercial expertise? How do we? This is something we're really interested in. In this initiative is how do we do things differently and work very closely with the private sector, and not just by bringing them in as partners along the way, but in getting them very involved in the design from the beginning, because they're the ones who are the experts in what's wrong with the market and how we make it work better. Thank you.
Thank you all. I think that's, you put a lot on the table. Just to reiterate briefly for those who may not be familiar with the project, the 3 pilots are incentivizing adoption and some innovation in storage technologies in Kenya, encouraging the adoption of the vitamin A certified maize in Zambia, and trying to encourage the application of a biocontrol for aflatoxin in maize in Nigeria, correct? So those are the 3 that are currently on the table. I just kind of wanted to follow up briefly on, it's maybe if Graham has anything else to say on sort of the technical side and innovation. Clearly there are lots of innovation in agriculture in particular, but then also for the donors. When I go back to the vaccine AMC, there was sort of there was very much sort of the motivation for it was to get innovation in areas where private companies weren't doing it for developing countries because the markets were so small and poor, and patents and intellectual property rights really wouldn't matter because they were just too poor. Even if you were able to patent it, they wouldn't be able to afford the project. So it was really for neglected diseases was kind of the original idea, although the working group report said, but of course this could also be used to encourage the acceleration of development of production capacity and marketing of vaccines in developing countries. And so the debate was sort of, malaria was an obvious one, or pneumo was one that was later stage, almost ready to go, really just needed the sort of production capacity. And they went with the pneumo vaccine. And here again, I understand that these are pilots and experimental, but I'm just wondering, the three pilots for the AgResults similarly, there's some potential for innovation on the grain borer with maize in Kenya with the storage technologies, but the AFLA safe is a technology that exists, and the fortified varieties, maize variety, exists, and so it really is just about adoption. I'm just wondering if you think there really are, and also Nancy and Bill have run into this with the cash on delivery aid, the fear of not paying out for donors seems to be just a really big barrier to really being sort of ambitious and innovative with these tools. And I'm wondering if you really do think, having worked on this for a few years now actually, whether A, there's that enough of an ability on the part of donors to take these risks, and B, enough patience to do an earlier stage where it really would be pulling an innovation that is going to take. And for that reason, I don't know if Ben Leo made it or not. I realize there are also some budgeting issues around how you do multi-year budgets. I also I neglected in my introduction to note that we have some representatives from the U.S. as well who are working on this initiative. Margaret Spears from AID, Rachel Bailey from Treasury, and Robin Steffen and her colleague from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So at any point, if you guys want to weigh in as well, but just some thoughts on, are we really going to be able to bump this up a notch? I mean, which is not to say, I think the current pilots, are great, but, we do need innovation as well. So any comments on that? And
Sure. So I'll take a stab at a few of those questions. I think you've hit the nail on the head, Kim, when you're talking about how the pilots that we're looking at, for the most part, are about adopting existing technologies. And I know Carrie just mentioned that in the long run, we really do want a mix between innovation-type pilots and adoption pilots, which we've come to call these pilots that are about adopting existing technologies. Now, what happened during the process when we were sourcing pilots was that we discovered that in the agriculture space, maybe a little different from the vaccine space, there are already a lot of existing good products out there, and the real barrier is actually getting them to market. And so we were able to come up with a lot of these examples and not as many on the actual the product doesn't exist yet side. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for that. One of them, I think Graham mentioned that sometimes you get people that are championing their own project, and so you might have different people involved in this process who have a particular interest in getting one type of technology out there or another. And the other reason might be that it's actually much more challenging to identify actual innovation gaps than it is to identify good products that just aren't getting to market. So I think there's a lot of different factors at play there, but I think it is important to keep in mind that agriculture is different from health and vaccine world, and that there may be different reasons and different barriers in the agriculture space that could make sense to have adoption pilots as well as innovation pilots. I also just wanted to comment on the donor risk-taking point that you made, and I'll be honest. I think this is a challenge for donors to think about this initiative differently than other types of aid that are out there. I mean, Carrie mentioned the challenges with ODA recognition and the typical considerations that donors go through before funding a specific project. And so I do think this is an ongoing challenge that we have to deal with. That are we willing to take this level of risks? I mean, I think with the group that we have now, there is definitely a willingness to do something different, to try something new, and that is what we're working on here. But there always is a tendency to look towards more traditional aid mechanisms and to see if we can get this to fit into that space. And so that is something that often comes up in our donor discussions. But do either of you want to add as well?
For me, one of the truest line of poetry is a line from The Wasteland from T.S. Eliot, which he says, "Between the thought and the action lies a shadow." And this is what I find in agricultural technology all over the place. And I'll give you an example of keg farms in India. This is a brilliant broiler company who realized that some very big players coming into the scene, and so they decided to go a different route, and they decided to breed a better backyard chicken, which they have done. They're not the only person who's come up with a better backyard chicken. It lays twice as many eggs, and it grows to twice the size in half the time. But the real clever thing about it, is what is different about them, is he worked out how to work out a business model to deliver that. He grows them, he does 25 million day-old chicks. He sells them to 1,200 outgrowers who grow them on for 2 weeks and inoculate them, who sell them to little guys on bicycles, who sell them to backyard chickens, backyard women producers. Each one of those women will not only improve her protein diet, but they make about $2 or $3 each. That's something like $50 million of incremental income at the forest. And what's clever about it is partly the technology side, but it's the delivery. And actually, we don't think enough about the delivery. There seems to be an enormous number of people who come up with terribly clever ideas, but actually that translation is a weakness. And that's why, perchance, we happen to come up with more on that particular section.
Rachel or Margaret, Robin, anything you want to add at the moment, or if you want to wait and chime in later, that's fine too. Okay, I see one
Sorry?
here and then one in the back. Do we have a mic?
I can speak pretty loudly.
Well, we're trying to record
Okay.
it. Alex, do you need the
Yeah.
mic? And please introduce yourself before asking your question.
Okay, my name's Noel Gerwick. I'm at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. Thank you all very much. So I have a naive and very broad question. You know, looking at the scope of this study, it focuses on smallholder livelihoods, and thinking about the 3 pilots that you're talking about, I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on how each of them specifically addresses smallholders as opposed to larger scale ag operations.
Well, I mean, let's just take one of them to give you just an example, and then I'll elaborate a little bit. On the on-farm storage, what you discover is that if we just concentrate on one of the technologies, which is the hermetically sealed bag, it's about $3. It probably lasts 3 seasons, so it's $1 a season. If you save, let's say, 7 or 8% of the thing from being chewed by weevils, for your dollar investment, you might get $1.15 back. That is not nearly enough for smallholder farmer. Smallholder farmer, if he invests $1, he wants 3 back at least. Actually, what we've discovered was that they could only store around about 2 months' worth of maize. They then switched into buying maize in the retail market, and that's the big difference. So for every $1 that they invest, they will probably, in that particular period, when they're not buying their retail prices, they're using their own maize, it will save them something like $9. So on average, $1 in, you should save yourself $6. And in dealing with poverty, you've got 2 ways to do it. You either increase people's living, or you save them costs, and this one would be focusing on that. On the aflatoxin, in particular, what we were looking for there was that if you can create a market for aflatoxin, the people who are selling it into that particular market, where they get a premium price and it creates a market opportunity, will you eat that aflo-safe treated maize themselves, thus having the benefits for their family. And on the final one, which is the biofortified maize, I mean, the intention is that it does create an additional market for them to be able to sell their product in. But a very important point, because actually in this particular instances, you don't expose smallholders to market risks. So the first instance, it will be commercial farmers, but you want to create sufficient critical mass that there is a market which smallholders and other people can apply to.
I think I saw a hand in the back on the aisle there.
Hi, I'm Valerie Rowe with CRS, and just a question about the companies and the pilots. You said there's about 5 or 6 different companies for each of the pilots. Can you talk a little bit about the process of how those companies were selected, and are they in-country, private sector, or multinationals, or how is this working?
I'll give that a try, and then Graham can correct me. So first of all, they haven't been selected yet. Those are just the companies that we've received interest from. And we've had a lot of in-country consultations and trying to do outreach to meet with different companies. Some of them are local. For example, in the on-farm storage case, there's some Kenya-based companies. There's also companies producing on-farm storage technology around the world. I was able to meet with a company from Tanzania and also one from South Africa, just in that case. But in terms of how these are actually being sourced, we'd like to have that be open. So to launch these pilots and have companies be able to apply. Now you will have to actually apply. For instance, in the on-farm storage case, you'll have to have a product and say, we think this product is good, and then we'll get the product tested to make sure that it holds up to the standards that we want. So you will have to go through some sort of application process, but we don't intend for it to be exclusive from the get-go. There are some standards that are applied, but we want it to be open, and we're seeking to attract multiple participants. But I'll get Graham to correct me in case I've misspoken on anything there.
That was the interesting thing, was actually the private sector were really intrigued. They were really interested in what we were doing, and they weren't multinationals. They were local businesses or regional businesses.
Just add a little bit on that and then ask a question. Because the idea of, in the AMC, the vaccine case, you had to sign contracts because in exchange for getting an upfront subsidy to cover the cost of investing in production capacity, the donors wanted a long-term commitment to then continue selling the vaccine for a certain period of years, at a lower price, an affordable price for developing countries. So, but I think in a lot of these cases, there was not at least so far, that kind of a model of a contract that for long-term supply. And I think the sort of ideal is that it wouldn't be selecting companies at all, right? It would be that, the idea of a prize, you're not selecting anyone. You're putting up and saying someone who develops this technology, and if it's a prize that includes adoption as part of the mechanism, you would say you develop this and you deliver it, and it is demanded by smallholders who want storage bags. Sort of in the ideal, and this is I think some of the things they're running into in practice, is that it would be any company that is able to develop that product and sell it would then get a subsidy. So that's I think kind of the market development, market creating kind of a model that we're all searching for and haven't sort of come up with the right pilot yet. I don't know if any of you have comments on that. And the other thing that I had also wanted to, on this idea of sort of where do you find the resources, again, in the vaccine case, sort of the whole idea was to draw in the large multinationals who have the capacity and the resources to develop vaccines for diseases. And I just wonder whether there is any, I know there was some political pushback from folks who didn't want to subsidize big multinationals. But again, the idea wasn't to subsidize them, to subsidize the public good of providing vaccines, but only by providing a normal market return. And I wonder, is there any thinking at all that there might be some value in trying to engage some of the larger multinationals, seed companies again, new varieties to deal with climate change? Any idea of, because my other impression from the current set of pilots is that one of the problems was ensuring you had partners that had access to finance to do these initial upfront investments, because they're supposed to get paid when they deliver at the end. And so one way of dealing with that would be to deal with partners that have deeper pockets. So any thoughts from anyone on sort of any of those issues?
Maybe start and then I think Graham will also have some comments and maybe Zoe as well. Sorry, I just turned my mic on. I think that's what I mean when I'm talking about global game changer pilots. Because the issue that Graham's pointed to on adoption, yes, it's a critical one. And that's why I think what we need are a range of different kinds of pull mechanisms to test, because different things will address different problems in this sector. And different things will work on a particular issue with pests in a particular country compared to the sorts of other solutions we're going to find to things like fertiliser, or hope to find to things like fertiliser, where I do see much more involvement. And that's what I'm talking about when I ask about the best ways to get engagement up front in design, and where are the incentives, where is the tipping point, how do you to design a new technology, how do you work on all those things in partnership with the private sector. So I think the next generation of pilots, that's going to be something we're particularly interested in testing, and that will be possibly what Kimberly's talking about as a more traditional, if you can use that word in association with pull mechanisms and innovation, a more traditional kind of pull mechanism. Graham?
One of the things that we found that you had to really engage with is that if you're going to pay for results, you need to know who you're going to monitor. So you have, in some places, to be able to select who you're working with. Because they have to record certain things. If you happen to be a manufacturer of containers which are going to be used for storage of things, we have to know what their numbers are, and they have to tell us who they've sold to for us to verify that, because we have an independent verifier who makes sure that actually the on-farm storage is being used for what we expected, rather than as sandbags or anything else. The second issue is, and it's a sweet spot, because it is very important that the private sector feels it has skin in the game and feels that it's part of this process. And we had a whole thing around random selection of the private sector. And you can imagine having 10 private sector and say, well, randomly you haven't been selected, but you have. There's nothing that is going to annoy them more. So there are some real difficulties about when you work with the private sector, how you do it.
I think there was a question back there, just in front of the last question, and then we'll come up here to the front for a couple of questions.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow organization based here in the USA, though our presence in Kenya, we have an office in Kenya too. What I wanted to ask is, how do you work with civil society, with the G20, the G8, and you all? I work with the small farmers in the rural areas of Kenya on poultry, on potatoes, nutrition products, but it's very, very difficult for us to get funding and for us to get help to help these small and medium farmers. When you talk about innovation and multi-million-dollar companies, how do they collaborate with the civil society and these small farmers? And who are the experts? I think the experts are the people actually on the ground. So if they don't get the message, they don't get the funding resources and get educational tools to work with big corporations like the ones you are talking about storage, they don't know all about them. Even I don't know about them. How do we work with you guys and those on the ground, the multi-million people or companies that are working on the ground? It's very difficult. Thank you.
That's a really good point, and I think, I mean, one of the things we'd like to see develop here would be some collaboration with civil society. I had the opportunity to run a consultation event in Kenya, actually, on the on-farm storage pilot, where we had representatives from government, from civil society, from the private firms, and from academia. And this is one of the issues that came up a lot, which was the private firms were saying, well, we can make these storage containers, but we have no idea how to get them to the farmers. And the civil society was saying, well, that's what we do all the time. And so I was there saying, well, why don't you switch business cards? And maybe there's a role for the private firm that's working towards this prize to actually be engaging these civil society organizations, hiring them to help with the dissemination of their product. And so we really do want to encourage that kind of collaboration, but at the same time, we're hoping for some market-driven results. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if we saw some of those operating models on the ground as they develop. And I do think it's very important that that there's linkages that are made among all the different actors in these spaces.
Just the bit that I would add on that is that actually in designing these schemes you have to be rather hands-off. And what you're trying to do is that you want the private sector to learn, if it's going to engage with your smallholders, Rosemary, that it has to work with some NGO that actually has a network to be able to get that message out in a way where we are nudging them into doing exactly what Zoe was saying, is to form those partnerships, forms those relationships, and realize it's not just about selling bags to the government sector and to donors. It's about how do you work a business model up which works with the smallholder sector, and part of that equation will be how you channel your information through NGOs.
There's up here, and then over to John.
Hi, I'm Rena Eichler with Broad Branch Associates, and I actually work on results-based financing in the health sector. and not somewhat at this global sort of advanced market commitment level, but also within countries and at the service delivery level. And there actually are so many parallels to what we're doing in the health sector you wouldn't believe. I mean, really there are. Except probably agriculture maybe is in some ways more complicated because you're not dealing only with sort of fixing kind of an NGO incentives in the government sector with a bit of private sector. It's much more commercially driven. There are differences. I think there's a lot to learn. I wanted to throw out something. I don't know if you've thought about this, but in listening to you speak, part of it, what I'm hearing is that to throw out, let's say, a call, we're looking for an innovation to solve problem X. You're needing to pick those problem X's that you're looking for innovations for. Have you thought about some convertible one metric that agriculture could use, like the carbon market uses CO2 emissions as the one metric? And health potentially is going to use the DALI, which is the disability adjusted life year. And if you could come up with a metric that and then a technology or a methodology that shows that the whatever it is, all the things you've talked about contribute to this ultimate objective. That could be the thing that spurs more innovation rather than sort of having to meet and pick and choose. Just throw that out as an idea.
While John's getting his question together, I was just going to comment that sounds a lot like, I'll put my Will Masters hat on. He's up at Tufts, and he has this idea for it's a different kind of proportional prize, I think, it has a specific, than the way the proportional prize is used in the AgResults context, but it's sort of similar where it's just agricultural productivity, and then of course the thing you have to worry about there is sustainability, because you can raise productivity by just dumping a whole bunch of fertilizer, but that's not necessarily a good thing. So that's kind of a trick. But his basic idea is to have a prize that would be paid proportional on, and you could incorporate sustainability in his mechanism to reward any innovation that contributes to agricultural productivity based on the social benefit of that innovation. And yeah, I think it's a very interesting idea. It's very costly on the monitoring and evaluation side, and a lot of people think it'd be more likely to reveal sort of innovations than to stimulate new ones, but that could be useful. So I think that's something you might want to take a look at that he has been promoting for agriculture. That's kind of similar to that idea. John?
Thanks a lot, Kim, and thanks for a great panel. I'd like to go back to the discussion on innovation. Oh, I'm sorry, John Simon with Total Impact Advisors. I'd like to go back to the discussion on innovation pull mechanisms versus adoption mechanisms. And I think Ms. Marks was spot on that in this sector, adoption is the greater challenge, which differentiates it from, for instance, the health sector with something like the AMCs. But the challenge in adoption is not at the supplier firm level, it's at the smallholder level. I mean, there are fertilizers, there are high quality plants, there are all sorts of inputs that are available and smallholders could get, but they don't. And if you look at Esther Duflo's work, which foots exactly with the experience that our clients have had in agriculture in Africa, the problem is the smallholders are not willing to invest enough to buy those things, not because they don't believe they will work, but because agriculture is a very variable business, and you can have the best product, best fertilizer, the best plant species, the best variety, and the rains may not come and you're wiped out. And if you're a smallholder, that's devastating in a way that it just isn't for your modern farmer in a developed world, in the developed country. So how do you get a pull mechanism that deals with that issue of the smallholder being able to afford the wonderful things that you're going to be incentivizing suppliers to supply?
I'll try this one. So I think Graham and I both know the most about the Kenya project, so that's why we keep referencing it. But I will say that in Kenya, where we're trying to get the adoption of this technology, we already have smallholder farmers. A lot of them use fertilizer. A lot of them buy their seed every year. So we are looking at a market where there's some understanding of the need to buy inputs each year. So that may be easier than some of the markets that you're talking about here, where there isn't that culture around buying the inputs. So that's just one thought.
Yeah, I mean, this could be a huge argument. Not an argument, but I mean, it's a very interesting debate, and I certainly, on the broader storyline, we are seeing that when we do the numbers about where it's needed, most of the growth is going to be in the urban market in the developing world, and how are we going to feed that? And actually, we find that the smallholder market discussion is not nuanced enough, and there is a huge difference between smallholders and larger scale smallholders, and the emergence of the commercial family farming sector would be where we would really want to put our efforts. And the other one is and some of them happen to be in the right location, and some of them, so in other words, they're within 4 hours of the city, and so on and so forth. So it's really quite complex, but it comes down to profitability at the end of the day. If farming is sufficiently profitable, then they will invest in technology. And how do you make that break out of that particular thing? And it is a hell of a problem. I agree with you. But we've seen all sorts of interesting things. I mean, we've done some very interesting numbers around agribusiness indicators. And what we find is huge differences between countries in the number of input suppliers. And we know from anecdotal information and various other things that if a farmer has to go over 8 kilometers to pick up his seed and fertilizer, his purchasing drops off quite significantly. So there's a whole medley of different things out there, but partly it is around access. And the other one is that some of the clever input suppliers do go for small prices. Most smallholders, I think, would be able to afford $3 for a bag. If they find it work, they'll buy another one, and they'll buy another one. And some of the clever input suppliers have been breaking down their inputs into smaller packages of seeds, smaller packages of fertilizer. So we are seeing some kind of solutions coming up.
And I think the sort of broader answer as well is that nobody's proposing that this is the solution to everything. Clearly, it has to be, where you're going to use this particular tool, is only going to be in certain situations where you have, some minimum level of market activity, I think, and then within, depending on market dynamics, choose among the various kinds of pull mechanisms that you have available. And if markets are just really bollocksed up, then you might want to look at something like cash on delivery aid, government to say, we'll reward you if you fix your, ag markets. Again, once we can find that indicator to use for the cash on delivery aid. But Jerry?
In the end, is the bank managing the money? Who's actually going to write these contracts and sort of hold these? I mean, you're talking about an evaluator, but who's going to hold them responsible for complying with them in the end?
I can answer some of that. When we set this up, the bank has acted as a temporary secretariat. Graham can talk more about how they've sourced some of the work already, or the companies already involved. But as Zoe has already said, there's been no formal endorsement process for that yet. That will still come. So the bank has actually set this up. The bank has acted as a funder for this, while donor money is in a temporary account, or a donor balance account, we call it. And we're in the process of setting up a trust fund now, so that a secretariat and evaluator can operate.
And did the bank issue their requests for proposal?
I'm not sure it's been that formal, but I'll.
Sorry. So the governance structure here is a little complex. We actually have at the steering committee a diagram with a lot of different colored boxes on it that those of us in the steering committee here are very familiar with. But I'll just clarify a few things. This isn't run by the G20. It's been endorsed by the G20. It's run by a steering committee of donors plus the World Bank, who's a non-voting member of the steering committee.
Just to go for donors.
Oh, sure. So Canada, Australia, United States, Gates Foundation, and DFID, UK, are the 5 members of the steering committee, plus the World Bank. The World Bank's been acting in a temporary capacity as secretariat, and we're hoping that there'll be a financial intermediary fund established at the World Bank very soon, and that will be where the money is physically held. To go into a little more complex, DFID has run a procurement process for the independent evaluator, so they'll be contracting the evaluator directly. The World Bank has run the procurement process for the Secretariat, which is still in progress. So there's a hope that when the Secretariat is appointed, there'll be a transition from the temporary Secretariat to the permanent Secretariat. So yeah, there's a lot of boxes on the diagram, but hopefully that's a little more clear. Yes, so the World Bank will be the trustee managing the financial intermediary fund.
Bertrand, do you have anything? Bertrand has been on the financial side at the bank in that office.
I think he drew the diagram.
And I think that's also on the website, is it not?
The governance, yes.
Okay, are there any other, oh, there's one in the back there. And if anybody, if you know, puts on your brainstorming hat and has ideas for what the next round of pilots should include, you can also do that over a drink here in a few minutes, but I'd invite you to throw those out, please.
Fred Smith with Commonics International. Just to follow on the programmatic side of this, in terms of the pay for performance, how much would that be? Is that like on a cost for recovery basis? Is there some premium? How does that part of it work?
Obviously, setting that number is a minor art which we're still learning to do. But broadly, what you need to do is to come up with a sufficiently attractive figure that you entice the private sector to go places they wouldn't normally go and to do things they wouldn't normally do. So that there is a subsidy component. But it drops off very quickly in time. So it's time limited and it's diminishing. And the example on the on-farm storage is actually the initial unit subsidy that they will get for every ton of additional storage that they create is about half the social benefit, and it rapidly drops off. The same kind of business model was applied to the vitamin A, which is for every ton of vitamin A that you get out into the marketplace, we will pay you so much, but it drops up as the volumes increase.
I think this also goes a little bit to John's question of what kind of pull mechanism to use in what circumstance. And kind of the way I think about it is prizes you use, and I'd be interested if you react, but sort of prizes you use when there is sort of a nascent market there and maybe you just need to kind of get attention to it, capture the private market's attention, and provide a fairly small inducement just to get them interested. And I think this was kind of the model for the Haiti mobile money, where phone companies and banks were going to go in and start providing mobile money options on cell phones in Haiti at some point, but donors wanted to accelerate that after the earthquake, and so they put up a sort of prize amount for each new subscriber signed up for mobile money on one of the existing cell phone companies. I think the idea of the advanced market commitment, or what I would call a sort of a per unit subsidy, is more this idea of where you have some innovation or you have economies of scale, and a product could be viable in a market once you sort of get past those initial cost hurdles, whether it's R&D, product development, or maybe investing in the supply chain. Sort of so if you can subsidize those initial investments, you can get to a viable market, but that may be a different pricing structure, maybe, because you actually do have to, I think, probably, again, the idea of the vaccine agency was to mimic the market, so the donors were basically, subsidizing what would have been a profit in a market situation, but simply wasn't there in a poor developing country. So I kind of think of those as being sort of two different types of pull mechanisms, two different situations where the pricing strategy is probably going to be a little bit different depending on, what's your market situation. And I think I saw another hand here in the middle, and then Rachel wants to add something.
So I'm curious about, thinking about the kind. I'm sorry, Noel Gerwick. I'm at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. I'm sorry, it's fine. So when you're talking about technologies and the kinds of products that you're trying to incentivize in one way or another, I'm thinking about what a product means, and what a product means in an agricultural sense, and it could be the kind of thing you're talking about, a hermetically sealed bag, or a variety of corn. But if I'm thinking about how ag systems work, I shy away from thinking about them on an item-by-item basis. It's more, do you have a 3-year rotation that incorporates some perennial crops someplace and maybe integrates livestock, which provides manure in some years and is more resilient than an annual crop in other ways, and it's harder, I think. I'd be curious for your reactions to this, for an individual supplier to turn a profit by supplying an integrated system like that. So I guess I'm just curious, as you have thought about and explored the kinds of innovations that this particular program and this particular mechanism might incentivize, where that fits in sort of the larger scope of the kinds of agricultural systems that make sense for smallholder farmers and the range of investments that we need to support adoption of these more integrated approaches. Which ones will this work well for? Which ones do we need a different kind of assistance mechanism for? Just any thoughts you might have on that.
Want to think about it while Rachel gives her thoughts on the work?
Yeah, right.
This is just to add 2 thoughts to what Kimberly said about how we think about prize amounts. So just to flag that obviously this is part of a risk-reward dynamic. So if we think that we're asking enterprises to take on more risk, then potentially we would think that there might need to be a higher reward for that. And then also there's another factor, I think people have mentioned a little bit, that we're trying to also support the development of different entities, businesses, private sectors. So you might think about the amount you might want to allocate to a total enterprise and how you might want to share it out. So you might be thinking that the reward for an entity might be X, even if the total reward for a particular pilot is a combination is much greater. So those are just some other factors that might be taken into account.
The points that you raise are very germane. Generally, what we try and do with a prize or something like this, to find out what the problem is, and you set that as what you're trying to solve, and you pay them for, and you ask them to come up with a solution. Sometimes it will be an integrated solution. I mean, the classic example was in the AFLA SAFE application, which is that there is probably a 10 to 15% premium from certain buyers for AFLA SAFE treated maize. But in order to make that economically and profitable and viable, farmers' yields needs to actually increase by about 50%. So part of the process is, will they use that premium to get the people that Rosemary was talking about, the NGOs, to act as trainers to be able to lift those yields so that you've got something sustainable. So that you're setting a target, but actually the different ways people use their tools is actually rather more complex than just pushing out an individual technology. So in the maize one, we do provide some upfront funding because we know that they have to go out and create a demand. And whether this is put adverts on television with the greatest footballer in Zambia saying, the reason I score goals is that I eat this particular maize, would be the kind of creativity that we would hope to trigger.
To add to that, I think we've got to not shy away from some of the tough problems that we're facing here as well, and that of course the situation that Graham's just described makes it difficult, or more difficult than to isolate what you've achieved via a pull mechanism and what you may have achieved via public education or other things. So it is really complex, and some of these things, I mean, that's one of the reasons we're spending such a lot of money on an evaluation mechanism, because it's going to be also a new way of thinking on the learning side about how we distinguish some of these things, and some of them will fail, and that's part of it. That's part of it.
Let's take these last 2 questions here. Maybe 3 if you can be quick, right in this cluster. Go ahead, and then the lady in front, and then the lady
I'm Steve Bell from Apt Associates. I'm wondering, what's the audience for the results here? If you demonstrate success in one or more of these projects, who are the actors that will take this adoption, that one, maybe more than one, to scale beyond the pilot areas? And have you thought yet about messaging your findings to reach those actors?
Why don't you just pass the message? Mike is going to take these three and then you can respond and any final comments.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to respond to something that Graham and Carrie both said now. 2 of these 3 pilots have the solution is on the ground in the field for agriculturalists. Oh, by the way, I'm Kitty Cardwell and I'm with the USDA, seconded to the bank at the moment. So 2 of these projects have a public health outcome as the final outcome. And I would hate for you to see the success of the intervention and the incentive is only whether or not the farmer adopted it. Because on these more complex, they're really gnarly issues where you're trying to get a food type to change for a public health benefit. You've got to wait. The incentive hopefully will give you time to get the entire social marketing mechanism in place. Otherwise, it won't work. So somehow maybe even some of the metrics of success might be that whole market mechanism worked. The more extensive.
My name is Denise Mainville. I'm with Apt Associates. And actually, I just had a few thoughts based on Noel's question, which is relating to the structure of what I understand to be kind of the structure of the AgResults. And really, fundamentally, AgResults is designed to address market failure. So if you want to address a relatively complex problem, then you need to define very clearly what is the market that is failing. And then the next step is that in order to successfully implement that sort of mechanism, then you have to address the question of how are we going to show that that market failure has been resolved. So I thought it was really intriguing that you had the, Rena said, maybe you could come up with a single indicator. And when you were talking, I think Graham was talking about the greenhouse gases with the nitrogen and paddy rice. That's a really exciting kind of thing that you can look at a very global problem and leave room for that innovation. But I think in direct response, you have to be able to address you have to be able to define what that market failure is and have a specific indicator that you can test. And unfortunately, it can't be something like, the number of people who, and you can't pick one element of an integrated solution, because then people will start to kind of teach to the test and say, look, they really want goats, and we're going to get goats even if we don't have anything else. We'll just pretend we have everything else, right? So it's harder, I think, with more complex structures. And that's where I think, those initial adoption ones are really looking, as Graham said, at nudging towards the solutions that are being sought. So that wasn't a question.
Good comment. Why don't we just start here and we'll go in reverse order to wrap up both responses and any final words.
I'm just really glad that this was raised, because it's one of the questions that I was hoping would be answered from the floor, is how do we get to scale? How do we measure this and work out what's responsible for what effect and which parts we can move into other areas or replicate. So I don't think we know the answers to this yet. I do agree with Kitty that it's very complex, and that sometimes that's going to mean that we have to focus on the right solutions and a whole range of different kinds of mechanisms that are context specific. At the same time, there's that competing desire to get this one measure that we can somehow, measure one kind of initiative and the success rate against another. So I think that's going to be tricky, and I'm glad we've got evaluators who can look at some of those big picture questions for us, because we certainly don't have all the answers at this point.
The point that I just raised to Steve is, essentially what this is potentially a new tool in the aid toolkit. I don't think it's a big tool, but I think it might be small and important. And the people who will be most interested in it will be USAID, World Bank, IFAD, and so on and so forth. They're the people who want to know, is this something that we should add to the different range of instruments that we can pull?
Yeah, so I'll just say to wrap up, I found these questions really, really great, and I think you can see from our responses that we're still thinking through a lot of this, and I expect this will be an initiative that goes through a lot of phases of development in the next few years, and hopefully we'll see a lot of different types of results coming out. I think Carrie said earlier it's both high risk, it's very high risk and very low risk, and I think that's how we're approaching it now, to say we have some interesting things we want to do. They may succeed and they may fail spectacularly, but at least if they fail, we haven't spent the money, so we can try it with something else. So I mean, I really hope that you follow the initiative, and you let us know if you have ideas or ways to move this forward, or ways that you're interested in contributing to the process.
Well, please join me in thanking the panel